Good afternoon. We want to welcome you to this afternoon's LaRouche National Town Meeting of the LaRouche Organization. And today, this is, of course, Martin Luther King weekend. We've entitled our presentation, From the Mountaintop, Thinking About Humanity in a Time of Crisis. We're going to begin today by attempting to start from that mountaintop, and we are starting with a song done by Franz Schubert, Frühlingsglaube, or Faith in Spring. Those of you who are familiar with our sister organization, the Schiller Institute, named after the poet Friedrich Schiller, know that we've tried to make the point that in times of crisis, the concept of beauty, that which unifies, is far more important than any concept of division or partisanship. But more importantly, there's also the idea and the sense of beauty that goes beyond words. That is the thing that can touch any human soul and any human heart. And so we're going to hear the song. You'll see there's a subtitled. It's in German, and it's sung by Michelle Aaron. Thank you, Michelle and Margaret Greenspan, by whom she was accompanied. The figure Martin Luther King is one of the most misunderstood and least appreciated in American history, despite the fact that he has the only personalized national holiday. We've done away with Abraham Lincoln. We've done away with George Washington. We've done away with a lot of American history, but at least Martin Luther King has figuratively survived. But people don't really have a real appreciation of the character of King. They know a few phrases and they often cite him, generally taking his name in vain, as they probably may very well do this holiday, speaking about racism and white supremacy and many things that they will allude to in the name of Martin Luther King. What we're going to do is we're going to play for you a short excerpt from his final speech. And this is the beginning of the speech. And remember, this is a speech in front of sanitation workers, about 600 of them, and their supporters during the course of a strike. It was given on a very, very rainy night, stormy night in Memphis, Tennessee. 24 hours later, Dr. King would be dead, and Dr. King had premonitions of his death. And so he wanted to give, if you will, not only his last eulogy, I wouldn't put it that way, but he wanted to give a strong statement of his sense of principles. And he did it in this speech, and we're going to hear now a short excerpt, after which I will read another section of the speech.
Something is happening in Memphis. Something is happening in our world. And you know, if I was standing at the beginning of time with the possibility of taking a kind of general and panoramic view of the whole of human history up to now, and the Almighty said to me, Martin Luther King, which age would you like to live in?
Notice, as I told you, he's speaking to an audience of sanitation workers, garbage men. They were ununionized. Many of them had not even gone to the 8th grade. And how does he begin? He says, as you know, if I were standing at the beginning of time with the possibility of a general and panoramic view of human history, that's the way you organize everyone, especially the most oppressed and the least literate. Dr. King recognized that as something that no longer exists in our political discourse. Matter of fact, we talk to people at the highest level from the lowest standpoint. This has to stop. It's the ability to think in terms of how we would actually mobilize our neighbors at the highest level that we are concerned with. So I want to take a little bit more from that point in Dr. King's speech. He said, I would take my mental flight by Egypt, through, or rather across the Red Sea, through the wilderness on toward the promised land. And in spite of its magnificence, I wouldn't stop there. I would move on by Greece and take my mind to Mount Olympus, and I would see Plato, Aristotle, Socrates, Euripides, and Aristophanes assembled around the Parthenon as they discussed the great and eternal issues of reality. But I wouldn't stop there. I would go on even to the great heyday of the Roman Empire, and I would see developments around there through various emperors and leaders. But I wouldn't stop there. Strangely enough, I would turn to the Almighty and say, if you allow me to live just a few years in the second half of the 20th century, I will be happy. Now, that's a strange statement to make because the world is all messed up. The nation is sick. Trouble is in the land, confusion all around. That's a strange statement. But I know somehow that only when it is dark enough can you see the stars. And I see God working in this period of the 20th century in a way that men in some strange way are responding. Something is happening in our world. So this idea is the true Martin Luther King, who was not a political figure. He was also a political figure, but he was primarily not merely a preacher, but a man of God. The idea of that is considered to be today sacrilegious in politics. And that's exactly why our country has run into the kind of problem it's run into, a problem in which many now believe that the only solution to any form of problem anywhere in the world is violence, including at the United States Capitol. Back in 2004, on January 19th, Lyndon LaRouche spoke to a meeting, a Democratic Party actually meeting down in Alabama in Talladega County on the occasion of Martin Luther King's birthday. And he had this to say.
So we do not face a new problem today, in one sense. We face the same problem in principle that Martin faced, and faced successfully. And I would propose that in the lesson of Martin Luther King and his life, there is something we can learn today which brings him back to life as if he was standing here alive today. There's something special about his life, his development, which should be captured today by us, not only in addressing the problems of our nation, which are becoming terrible, but the problems of our relationship with the world as a whole. How are we going to deal with these cultures that are different than our own? With an Asian culture, with Muslim cultures around the world, over 1 billion Muslims around the world, with the culture of China, which is different than ours, the culture of Southeast Asia, which is different than ours, the cultural background. They're all human, they all have the same ultimate requirements, the same needs, but they're different cultures. They think differently. They respond to different predicates than we respond to. But we must have peaceful cooperation with these people to solve a world problem. Then you start thinking about someone like Martin, and I want to indicate in the context I just stated what the significance of Martin is today. We had no replacement for Martin. Lesson number one. Martin was a unique personality. He was not a talented person who happened to stumble into leadership and could be easily replaced by other leaders who would learn the job and take over afterward. We had no replacement. No one in the position to replace him. Many wished to be, they didn't have it. What did Martin have? What was the essence of Martin that put him above, made him something special? Let's compare 3 cases to get at this. One, Martin himself. The other, the case of France's famous heroine, Jeanne d'Arc. And I'm rather familiar with the details of the actual history of the Jeanne d'Arc case, which is comparable in a sense, a very special way, to the case of Martin. And then also with a fictitious case, which points to the problem we face, the case of Shakespeare's Hamlet, especially the Hamlet of the third act soliloquy. Now, what was the issue? Martin was truly a man of God. Truly. In a way that very few people are actually able to realize in their lifetime. It wasn't just that he was a man of God, it's that he rose to the full appreciation of what that meant. Obviously, the image for him was Christ and the passion and crucifixion of Jesus Christ. That was his source of strength. He lived that. He had gone to the mountaintop at a point that he knew his life was threatened by powerful forces in the United States. And he said, I will not shrink from this mission, even if they kill me. Just as Christ said, and I'm sure that was in Martin's mind at that point. The passion and crucifixion of Christ is the image which is the essence of Christianity. It's an image, for example, in Germany or elsewhere where the Bach St. Matthew Passion is performed. It's a performance approximately. And those 2 hours, the audience, the congregation, the singers, the musicians, relive in a powerful way the passion and crucifixion of Christ. And this has always been important, to relive that, to capture the essence of what Christ means for all Christians. And Martin showed that. The difference is this, and I'll come back to John d'Arc, or called Joan of Arc in English. The difference is most people tend to believe, yes, I wish to go to heaven, or something like that. Or don't care. But they are looking for answers within the bounds of their mortal life. They're thinking of the satisfactions of the flesh, the security they will enjoy between the bounds of birth and death. Whereas the great leader, like Martin, rises to a higher level. They think of their life as the gospel presents it, as a talent. Life is a talent given to you. You're born and you die. That is your talent, and what you have in that period. The question is, you're going to spend it anyway. How are you going to spend it? What are you going to spend it to secure for all eternity? What are you going to do as a mission that will earn you the place you want to occupy in eternity? Martin had a clear sense of that. That Mountaintop address for me, it struck me years ago, clear, it was just a clear understanding of exactly what he was saying to others. Life is a talent. It is not what you get out of life, it's what you put into it that counts. Martin had that. That's why he was a leader, and I've known the other leaders with him in that period. They didn't quite have the same spark. They may have accepted the idea, they may have believed in it, but it didn't grip them the same way it did Martin. And it came to grip him, I'm sure, more and more as he took on more and more responsibilities. As a leader, you feel this, you see your people. You see the things you have to cope with, the suffering. You see the danger. And you have to find within yourself the strength not to flinch, not to compromise. Take the case of Jean d'Arc as the comparison.
And we invite you to take the case of Jean d'Arc by taking a good look at the full address that Lyndon LaRouche gave in Talladega, Alabama, which you will be able to get at this site or the Schiller Institute site. So we're faced now, this weekend and in general, all throughout the United States, with a great apparent conundrum, which is, how do we all retreat from our self-righteous hubris into a more perfect union of the nation? There's an idea called the principle of the coincidence of opposites, and it's one that has been being discussed recently, actually over the course of the past year, particularly by Helga Zepp LaRouche, the wife of the now deceased Lyndon LaRouche. It's been presented in several conferences, and it's been presented personally by her as well. And that's the great idea that has to be studied today. We may appear to be too small for this present historical task that faces us, but that's not true. In the winter of our present discontent, we have to have faith in spring. We have to choose to grow into that historical role. And so to discuss that today, we've assembled a panel for that purpose, thinking about humanity in a time of crisis. Not the United States, not the elections, not the presidency, not the left, not the right, humanity. And so I'm joined today by Harley Schlanger, who you've heard from many times, and of course people know him as a major spokesperson for the LaRouche organization and for his daily updates. Paul Gallagher, who's with us, the economic editor of Executive Intelligence Review. Marcia Mary Baker, who's co-editor of Executive Intelligence Review, and Diane Sayer, who's a candidate for United States Senate for 2022, running proudly against Chuck Schumer. And so we're going to start off with Harley. So Harley, take it away.
All right. Thank you, Dennis, very much. I'm going to give a summary view of the intent of the military-industrial complex behind the January 6th Reichstag fire event at the US Capitol, and the rush to judgment impeachment. What unfolded is classic British counterinsurgency strategy. Let's begin with January 6th. This was a pretext for the next phase of a fascist coup. And this is something we'll be discussing this afternoon in the course of this meeting. Let me take you back to some statements Lyndon LaRouche made in 1971 following Richard Nixon's ill-fated decision to end the Bretton Woods system and move the United States into a economy of floating exchange rates, speculation, and what was in reality a post-industrial economy. This is something that LaRouche was warning about, had forecast would happen, and when it happened, he was very clear on what needed to be done. But most importantly, what he identified as the contributing factors were the decision of the global financial oligarchy to move into an era of environmentalism, post-industrial economy, and neo-Malthusianism, that is, global depopulation. And he identified this as, if it's not reversed, we're going to be heading to fascism. Not fascism as the image most people have of jackbooted soldiers marching with a swastika, but fascism as an economic system, typified by the role of Hitler's Minister of Finance, Hjalmar Schacht, who was the choice of the London, New York banking crowd to oversee the phase shift in Germany from an industrial republic to a destructive force targeting all of Europe and the United States. And it was that policy, which was the policy of the corporate cartels. Now, what we've seen in the United States since LaRouche made that warning in 1971 is a series of phase shifts, economically and politically. I'm just going to identify a couple of those, which are the more important ones, but one of them was the mid to late 1980s, when the Democratic Party adopted what they called the Third Way, dumped the policies of Franklin Roosevelt and John F. Kennedy, which were committed to the idea of uplifting the conditions for the whole of the population, and instead became neoliberals, essentially dependent on money from Wall Street and carrying out policies for the benefit of the wealthiest, including the bankers and financiers. That was the shift that brought us the Clinton administration. Al Gore was key in setting that up. Well, perhaps we're experiencing some of that censorship you've heard about. What I was discussing 9/11, that this was another forecast LaRouche made, that there would be a move toward a fascist policy following a Reichstag fire event, which we saw with 9/11. Now, the Patriot Act, which was introduced then, was based on something that Joe Biden authored in 1995 called the Omnibus Counterterrorism Act, which called for an expansion of the FISA policy, but most importantly, it identified terrorism as based on political beliefs. So when the Patriot Act was passed and pushed by John Ashcroft, he contacted Biden as trying to get Democratic support for it. And of course, Biden's support was based on your bill in 1995. That was another phase shift in the United States. And we know what it means to have not just the mass surveillance, but the use of social media to manipulate the way people think and act. We also had the permanent wars launched as a result of the Reichstag fire in September 11th, 2001. Permanent wars that we were in and still are in, but became the basis of Donald Trump's victory in 2016 by appealing to the American people based on their being tired of war, tired of austerity, saying that we're going to end these wars and rebuild our nation. Now, that was responded to by that military-industrial complex, the deep state, the swamp, or what we call the British Empire, by launching Russiagate to get rid of Donald Trump. And we identified this from the beginning as a regime change coup that intended not just to defeat Trump, but to change the country, to demoralize his supporters, and to prevent the United States from asserting its national sovereignty and building its economic power based on the principles of the American system. Now, let's jump ahead to what happened January 6th. There was a perfectly legitimate contest in the Congress, which has been done by the Democrats before. This was not unprecedented, challenging the certification of the electors. The Democrats did it in 2004 in the Bush-Kerry election and in 2016. But to read the mass media or watch the television coverage, it was as though this was some kind of absolute break with the traditions of American history. But it was a constitutionally defined action that was being taken. But what did happen was an event at the Capitol building. Now, there are many unanswered questions, and I just want to pose a couple of them without going into great detail. But these were brought up by the investigative journalist John Solomon. He pointed out that the New York Police Department, the Capitol Police, and the FBI all had advanced warnings that there could be violent protests at the Capitol when these hearings took place on January 6th. Now, keep in mind, on the FBI, this in itself can be somewhat suspicious, given that we know that the FBI repeatedly deploys people into organizations to be provocateurs. They did this with the civil rights movement. They did it with the people fighting the civil rights movement. They've done it with the left and right historically. And as it does clearly appear as though there were provocateurs in these riots, just keep in mind that the FBI supposedly had advanced notice. But here are the questions you have to look at. Why was there not more robust security if there had been these advanced warnings? The Capitol Police Chief, Stephen Sund, reported that he went to the House and Senate security leaders, personnel, and suggested they bring in more police, possibly the National Guard, and he was rebuffed. So there was not an adequate police presence on the Capitol when this started. But secondly, if you look at the timeline, the first assault on the Capitol began while President Trump was still speaking. And he was speaking for an additional 20 minutes when people started swarming into the Capitol building. And the question Solomon asked is, how can he be accused of inciting something that was pre-planned and started before he supposedly said the words that incited the crowd? This was not an incitement. It was a provocation. And that's why we see this as a Reichstag fire. Now, what was the result of what happened on January 6th? Well, the attempt to get rid of Trump moved ahead. The idea of impeaching someone in the last days in office is somewhat of a strange conception. But we know that Pelosi has been intending this for a long time. Now, what was more than this as an attack on Trump was an attempt to criminalize a movement. He got 75 million votes. And by pointing or presenting him as a madman, as a rioter, an insurrectionist, by implication, they're saying that anyone who voted for him was crazy, was an insurrectionist, was a potential danger. They criminalized the opposition to the policies by making it appear that if you didn't go along with the Pelosi-Schumer agenda, which, by the way, is the same agenda of a lot of the Republicans, as became clear in their weakness in defending the president from the impeachment, that if you go along with Trump, you're a potential criminal, a potential terrorist. They're out to change the Constitution, especially in the way elections are run. And the censorship policy, which was brought in, was designed to cut people off from an ability to communicate, to even discuss ideas. If you challenge the vote, the counting of the vote, you might be a terrorist and suspect and possibly get your access to internet platforms cut. Now, finally, the effect of this will be to increase the radicalization of some Trump supporters and set the phase for more violence in the future. And it would be done to justify more surveillance, more preemptive measures, and so on. Now, look, what was the Trump movement? It was people who were angry at watching the country go to hell. watching the cities collapse, the healthcare system be torn apart, our young men and women being sent to wars that are unwinnable, fighting for goals which are never specified by politicians who never served in office in the military and really don't care about the problems they're creating for the nation. And so you create an environment of polarization and radicalization. Now, the other aspect of classic British counter-gang strategy is you do it with the left and the right. You have left and right radicals that are fed by this process. We've seen it with the Black Lives Matter and Antifa. We see it on the right with the Q movement and militias. Many of the people who get caught up in these things are people who legitimately are concerned about what they see as a collapse of the system, collapse of society, but feel helpless to act through standard political means because the political system itself is so corrupted by big money on both sides, the left and the right. So what happens? Let's look at this QAnon just for a moment. And I know this is going to aggravate some people, probably enrage others, but you'd better face it now. If you were angry and frustrated and looking for some answers, many people turned to QAnon because it seemed to have an explanation of what was going on in the attacks on Donald Trump. But what was it really? It's a classic British operation of psychological warfare. It engaged people in a kind of political video game, a world of Warcraft for politics, where people were encouraged to watch what was going on, were given drops of information, little bits and pieces, which, by the way, were available in other places besides the QAnon postings. But think about what was said. There are 30 sealed indictments, 100 sealed indictments, 300 sealed indictments. Now I'm told they're saying there are over 220,000 sealed indictments. That's a lot of sealed indictments. How come people haven't been going to prison? We were told there would be mass arrests. We were told that Biden and Hillary Clinton are wearing ankle bracelets. That Gina Haspel, the CIA director, was killed in a non-existent shootout in Frankfurt, Germany. If she wasn't killed, she was sent down to Gitmo. Some of them say the Pope has been killed or replaced by a hologram. And what we're also told is, don't worry about the chaos ahead. The good guys are coming to the rescue. Trust the plan. Now, the hook was the attack on the corruption of a broken down system. But there was not a strategic perspective. People were not organized around a counter strategy other than wait for the good guys and cheer them on, and in the meantime become informed. Now, a lot of people did become awakened by the victory of Donald Trump and the events that took place afterwards. Much was exposed about the corruption of the intelligence community, the Clinton, Obama, and Bush networks in both parties, the corruption coming from the United Kingdom. But there were diversions, attempts to point people in different directions. And instead of going after the people pulling the strings, you went after some of the puppets, who were the ones that the string pullers were putting in your face. Now, what is the ultimate plan of the people who ran this? Well, this will be discussed coming up, but the basic point is to push through the Great Reset, to establish a global bankers' dictatorship that will essentially give the power to the people behind the banks, behind the central banks, but also in the corporate cartels, give them the power over not only the circulation and the production of credit, but where it's spent, where the money is spent. Eliminate the role of parliaments and governments and the Congress to make policy. Why? Because they're too pliable to try to answer some of the demands of their constituents. Put it instead in the hands of technocrats run by the banks so that we can have the kind of austerity that will not only allow them to pay off their debts, but kill off whole sections of the population. They don't intend to have a sound economy. That's not what the World Economic Forum and the Davos billionaires intend. They intend to radically reduce the world's population. That's their plan, a banker's dictatorship. And so while people were caught in the left-right gangs and counter gangs, this is what has been going on in the background. Now, there are still people who are saying, well, you're wrong. You wait and see. There's going to be an insurrection act. There's going to be martial law, mass arrests in the next week. Well, if it happens, we'll see. I don't believe it. And I think many of you are going to have a rude awakening when you realize you've been played by the same people who ran the impeachment against Donald Trump, the same people who have wrecked our economy and put the United States into the category of a near banana republic with the manipulations they've carried out over the recent weeks and months. We have a strategy at the LaRouche organization. We have a program, and it starts with 2 points. Know your enemy and how they think and how they manipulate you. And secondly, how do we revive the American system of physical economics, which was the great contribution that Lyndon LaRouche made in his many years in politics and statecraft in the United States. So I'll leave it at that and turn it over to the next speaker.
Thank you very much, Harley. And I want to just say that the banding about terms like fascism doesn't mean that you understand what it is. Today, in a discussion that we had just before this, we came up with this idea of making a short video called Stop the Steal at Davos. That, in other words, the idea should be that people should try to think about how to think about the actual causes for the circumstances that have recently erupted. And in part, we were very interested in having Paul Gallagher, who's the economics editor of Executive Intelligence Review, take up the challenge of busting up the axioms about that precise matter. So, Paul? Paul, I think you're muted.
You are right. Thanks for that as well. Okay. And thanks for Harley to essentially set out the situation in which this threat exists. We have to understand where it's coming from. If I could ask Dave to put up the one image of our magazine. This is our weekly magazine, Executive Intelligence Review, the one that just came out this past week. Is that possible? Maybe not. The picture was on the cover was what Harley referred to, the famous burning of the Reichstag, the German parliament, in late February of 1933. And the headline asked the question, cui bono, who benefits? Who benefits from the events in Washington on January 6th? When the Reichstag was set on fire, Hitler's Nazis had won an election 3 months earlier, but with only a third of the vote. The German president, there we go, the German president had named Hitler as chancellor a month before. Large funds to push Hitler's party into power had been raised internationally by the energetic effort of 2 central bankers, Montague Norman, head of the Bank of England, and a protege of his, Hjalmar Schacht, formerly head of the Central Bank of Germany, the Reichsbank, and about to become head soon again. These 2 central bankers were the most influential of the entire 20th century, not just in bringing Hitler to power. In fact, Schacht's great influence on economists and central banks today is increasing, even though he was Hitler's central banker and economics minister and made the arms production in the concentration camps possible. What Schacht was looking for in enthusiastically backing Hitler for 2 years before he came to power, Schacht had been involved in as head of the Reichsbank in the 1920s, imposing increasing degrees of economic austerity on the German people. This was in order to stop inflation, but it was brutal austerity, and Schacht was now looking for two qualities in a new party and a new chancellor or dictator. One being anti-American, which Hitler very comprehensively was, and the second was the ability to impose even more brutal austerity on people's living standards while at the same time putting them back to work. Schacht had created, with his previous in the 20s, had created or helped create nearly 12% unemployment even before the Depression hit in 1929, putting people back to work at the same time breaking their living standards down into essentially forced labor. So he and Norman led the push to get Hitler into power. A fire was set in the Reichstag in late February 1933 by a communist laborer who was known to have wanted to do it. He probably had help in the act, and the building security was let down. He was allowed to get in with fire accelerants. As soon as that happened, 4,000 people were arrested. An immediate new election gave the Nazis not a third of the vote, but now nearly 45% of the vote. 80 communist deputies who won seats in that election in the Reichstag were arrested, and Hitler suddenly had an absolute majority as a result. The biggest opposition parties were crushed. An already existing emergency law was used to make Hitler chancellor indefinitely, dictator. And immediately, Hjalmar Schacht himself became again head of the Reichsbank, central banker, and economics minister as well. What did he do? With the backing of the City of London, the Bank of England, Montagu Norman, and colleagues, Schacht within months began to use a scheme by which the Reichsbank printed huge amounts of money to take over the government's spending policies. Second, to control what was invested, what was exported, what was imported. He took over through the central bank, control of the very scarce quantity reserves of foreign currencies that Germany had, used them to control what was imported and exported, and to drive the German economy into rearmament production using forced drafts of labor and the first labor camps. Schacht used the power of the central bank as he used the Nazis he helped push into power for a mission. The mission was to force a shift in economic activity in Germany, a dramatic one. The shift was into arms production. In just 2 years, with Schacht printing money and increasingly controlling investment, arms production went from 2% of the German economy to 20% in 2 years. By the time Schacht fell out with Hitler and was fired in 1938, late 1938, war in Europe had begun. German arms production was a third of the economy. Production of housing and clothing had been significantly cut. Food production had begun to fall. Even electricity generation was becoming unreliable. Now, we've just had a Reichstag fire in Washington. 20 years ago, there was another, the 9/11 attacks, with the same characteristics. Security stripping, which allowed a terrible event to occur. Immediate assignment of blame for political purposes. In that case, demonstrating cui bono, who benefits, had already been done 9 months before the event by Lyndon LaRouche. In his public statement on January 3, 2001, that Dick Cheney and his Bush administration would look for some kind of Reichstag fire in order to gain emergency power. LaRouche knew that Cheney and Bush and British Prime Minister Tony Blair had a plan for regime change wars starting with Iraq and ending ultimately in confrontation with Vladimir Putin and Russia. This war plan had been presented in detail by Cheney's Project for a New American Century group and pushed hard by other Atlantist think tanks of the London-Wall Street special relationship. The 9/11 Reichstag fire in September 2001 rapidly triggered the whole plan, including the Patriot Act and the development of the surveillance state, which was only finally exposed by Edward Snowden and Julian Assange years later. And with the 2007-2008 global financial crisis, the central banks also took over the real levers of economic policy completely. The United States and European nations became surveillance states and stock market states, or speculation states, under those central banks' policy. 30 years before that, Harley has already indicated, an event of perhaps even greater magnitude and shock occurred. It was a great shock to Americans at the time, although now it's almost been forgotten thanks to the efforts of economists. That was when Nixon cut off the dollar from its gold reserve basis on August 15th, 1971. That signaled the destruction of President Franklin Roosevelt's Bretton Woods money and credit system. Again, Lyndon LaRouche had warned during the later 1960s that the end of Bretton Woods was coming at the hands of London financial policy. When it happened, LaRouche warned against a return of the fascist economics of Hjalmar Schacht by name. Roosevelt's Bretton Woods in 1945 had been constructed specifically to stop global speculation across borders by the biggest banks of the City of London and Wall Street and Frankfurt and so forth. It prioritized instead productive investments in infrastructure and industrial development. But the City of London banks, overseen by the Bank of England, broke down the Bretton Woods system for several years before finally forcing Nixon to surrender the gold reserve dollar. These banks created the high-interest, speculative euro-dollar markets to create huge dollar reserves outside of American control. And then, too, the central banks were ready to move and created the so-called floating exchange rate system, a speculative casino that has expanded continuously since. And around that 1971 disaster, we saw again how influential the fascist central banker Hjalmar Schacht remained. LaRouche's advance warning of what was called the Nixon shock on August 15th was so unique that LaRouche suddenly became a force for economists to try to deal with. One of the world's leading Keynesian economists engaged in a public debate with LaRouche about Nixon's shock break from the gold reserve dollar and his wage and price controls. And this leading Keynesian not only supported Nixon, he promoted the fascist Hjalmar Schacht against LaRouche. The professor even said that if Schacht had led Germany, Hitler's crimes, quote, would not have been necessary, unquote. That shed a lot of light on the fact that Keynesian economists who were, by 1971, becoming dominant in the profession, were continuing to recommend the policies of Hitler's central banker, whitewashing them as work creation by central bank money creation, as if Schacht's policies had nothing to do with the Nazis' concentration camp crimes. So now we have had a Reichstag fire event in Washington on January 6th. Official warnings of groups bent on violence were ignored and not passed up to the Trump White House for reasons not really being investigated. Security around the Capitol was strangely missing for reasons not really being investigated. Some citizens, angry over a corrupted election, were persuaded or pushed into following groups of violent provocateurs into the Capitol. Assigning blame to President Trump was quickly done. Democrats in Congress are excited by the prospect of expelling their opponents from Congress, just as the Nazis once did with the communist deputies after the original Reichstag fire, and suddenly having big majorities in both houses. Censorship is unconstitutionally clamped on President Trump, his supporters, and many others by digital oligarchs who control monopoly private companies. Cui bono? The Democratic Party? They are just looking for some super spoils from election, which will only grow more and more discredited among Americans. And they are clueless in restoring the economy from its dismal condition. The tech billionaires, they are flexing illegal censorship power on behalf of whom? Actually waiting to capitalize with a 5-day world summit from Davos, Switzerland, January 25th to 29th, in a week and a half, are the actual fascists. Doing the planning there will be the world's leading central bankers and large private banks. That will include the world's leading Paris Climate Accord and Green Deal organizer, who is Prince Charles of Britain. They will include Charles' close allies, the British central banker Mark Carney, and the destroyer of coal power, Sir Michael Bloomberg. They will include UK and European government ministers and the head Davos man, the president of the World Economic Forum, Klaus Schwab. They give their name recently to their plan, the Great Reset. But as the Green Deal, Prince Charles and the City of London bankers have promoted it since 2006. In the summer of 2019, in a big central bankers conference sponsored by the Federal Reserve, they used a different term, regime change, meaning that the central banks take over spending and investment from governments, Schacht style. Mark Carney began promoting at that meeting central bank digital currency, which is a means for central banks to grab spending powers from government and lending powers from private commercial banks. Shutting down fossil fuel energy and modern farming and nuclear sciences are the immediate actions they are attempting, but reducing the world's population is the ultimate goal and the result of the Green Deal. Fascism is not a force of governments, a military force of governments. It is a financial force of the biggest bankers and financial monopolists who take control of governments in crisis or emergency situations. The so-called Great Reset is an attempt to use the money printing and regulating power of central banks to shift economic activity entirely in the way that Hjalmar Schacht did 80 years ago, but not primarily into arms production as then, but to green throwback technologies, denying investment to the technologies of industrialization and forcing it into more primitive technologies. They call these technologies renewables, but they would probably better be called interruptibles. Only 1 week ago, the electrical grid system of all of Europe came close to blacking out entirely. Instead, only Austria and Romania got the blackout and saved the others. The huge build-out by Germany of interruptible wind and solar power has made the European electrical grid unstable after decades of strength and reliability. The more wind and solar power is built, the more unstable it gets. Our economies and people will not recover if this fascism now succeeds. But will they succeed? These bankers do not fear any armed resistance. They fear sovereign governments acting for progress. And one example, with just a week remaining in President Donald Trump's administration, his Office of the Comptroller of the Currency promulgated a rule called Fair Access to Financial Services that prohibits banks from, and specifically the biggest banks, from redlining companies or funds because they invest in modern energy technologies or invest in agriculture or in ranching. That redlining is exactly what the central banks are imposing around the rest of the world. That is what they call green finance, and they are doing it with a vengeance, in particular with regard to some countries in Southeast Asia and in Africa. Wall Street is very unhappy about this Office of the Comptroller of the Currency action. as evidenced in 3 consecutive days' lead stories on the American Banker website. Wall Street's TV channel CNBC reported the rule, quote, is not just opposed by the largest banks, but faced widespread opposition from legal scholars and environmental, social, and governance experts. Sure. The Trump administration did this. At the same time, he was issuing an executive order establishing Defense Department support for the Frontier small modular nuclear reactors at sea, on land, and on the moon and in space, specifically reminding in the order that the Navy developed the world's first peaceful nuclear reactors. And while he was getting released the documents on Russiagate and the British agents who launched it at the same time. The bankers have known since the Paris Climate Accord that Donald Trump was a powerful adversary of the Green Deal, committed to the advance of technology with government support. What they want from this January 6th Reichstag fire was already in a long lead editorial in the Washington Post on January 4th. Changes to the U.S. Constitution and electoral system to guarantee that no nationalist president can be elected again. But the leaders of Russia, of China, and of India are also committed to the advance of technology with government support. They are effective adversaries of the Green Deal, no matter how much they may talk about complying with the Paris Climate Accord in 2060 or thereabouts. The possibility of a united front for world industrial development among those 4 leaders is the nightmare of London and the central bankers, and the reason they have used British intelligence and U.S. intelligence for 4 years to drive Trump out. Their new name now for seemingly everything they do is the Great Reset, because they think the COVID pandemic has exhausted sovereign governments, unable to handle it, and ready to let the central banks take over not just finance, but all their important functions, essentially the definition of fascism. There is no reason, though, to think the central banking cabal will prevail if we are aware that there are many groups in the United States, many governments and political forces around the world capable of allying against this fascist Great Reset. There is no reason to think that green fascism will succeed if we are agreed on powerful economic and scientific policies for productive employment of some 500 million or more people worldwide who've lost their work due to this pandemic, nearly 20 million of them in the United States. In fact, the World Economic Forum chief, Schwab, who I mentioned before, has a new book in which he admits that they fear that governments might just succeed in overcoming this pandemic and therefore might fight harder against abandoning their powers to promote progress. All right, then, let's get people trained and employed in overcoming the pandemic and others that may threaten from it. Helga LaRouche has proposed this for a full year. A public health system which does not exist now must be built in every country. As the Schiller Institute has said, more than 10 million new hospital beds and clinic beds are needed worldwide against a pandemic like this, at least 500,000 of them in the United States. Building that kind of World Health System will employ 5 to 6 million people productively in the United States, 100 to 110 million internationally. It will take credit. It will take a lot of new electrical power, a lot of new fresh water supplies, and staffing. We spelled it out in EIR's report last May. The world needs 1.5 billion new productive jobs. And we said there, this is just the front edge. New fusion power and plasma technologies are needed, breakthroughs in space exploration. The better to do it, cut down the London and Wall Street banks' power by breaking them up with Glass-Steagall laws in every country and end this nightmare of speculation. Thank you. Back to you, Dennis.
Yeah. So to tell us how we're going to take ourselves out of our present winter of our discontent, we want to have one of the co-authors of the proposal that was just mentioned by Paul on the 1.5 billion jobs. Marcia Mary Baker, who is a economics editor of Executive Intelligence Review, is also working with the Committee for the Coincidence of Opposites that was founded by Helga LaRouche some months ago, specifically on the agricultural section of that committee, and she's here to talk to us today. So, Marcia.
Okay, well, I want to begin with what I think is maybe the worst institutional governmental initiative in 2020 for mass death other than war. And that's what in Europe is called the Green Deal, but especially the part of it that's agriculture called farm to fork. It was introduced last May by the European Commission to apply to 27 nations there. And it says in 10 years, what is to happen is that all the farmers are to reduce their inputs. They are to cut, I'm going to tell you exactly, land area by 10%. They are to cut down the fertilizer they apply by 20%. They are going to cut down what they apply against pests by half. They're going to cut down any vaccines or medicines for livestock by half. So you figure this Green Deal called Farm to Fork is less in and less out. You're going to get less food, aren't you? Here you see the promotion of it, and thousands of farmers, dozens of thousands, have taken to the streets in the last year and a half against this specific report, but against this thinking. They demonstrated with tractors in Berlin, in Amsterdam, and everywhere. And you see the insidious promotion here called for a fair, healthy, and environmentally friendly food system. Now, in fact, each nation is supposed to implement this, and it's historic. In Britain, they aren't a member of the EU now, but they became the first of the pack, and a couple of months ago passed their program called Agriculture Law. And they said this is the first time ever that agriculture program is going to be based on the environment, not on supplying food for people. The food part is to be secondary. Now, the results, let me tell you about the quantity of less food for people. If you take all the food types, wheat or vegetables or dairy, beef, and you calculate how much less would be produced by reducing inputs in the way the Farm to Fork Green Deal said, you will get a horrendous picture that in a 10-year period in Europe, there would be less food for 20-some million fewer people than there would otherwise be food for, even if they had some hunger. Wheat would drop by half, or oil seeds would drop. Now, this graphic shows what the U.S. Agriculture Department did. They calculated all of the math about how much less food there would be in Europe alone if this was done, how much there would be in the world as a whole if this was done. And this graphic is from the Agriculture Department. And down at the bottom of the graph, it goes from 0 to 200 million people. And look at the long gray lines going across. In the 10-year period, by 2030, you would have less food for 185 million people in the world, on top of whoever may have already been projected to be hungry. And so in between, if only the EU and some of its trading partners like Canada or Argentina collaborated on this insane Green Deal, you would have less food for 100 million people. So think of the mathematics, how crazy it is. Who would do this? Well, Harley and Paul already described who would do this. These, the financial networks that include the banks principally, but also the commodity wing of the same networks. And so what you are seeing in this Green Deal in Europe regarding food, the means of existence, is the applied form of the Great Reset that this gang talks about, and they're going to promote publicly, very big, at the end of January. And so this is clear that the implication of this is clear, and we know how hideous it is because it comes on top of already our world hit by the pandemic and hit by famine. Let's look at that more closely. Now, let me just give a short update here about the briefing that was given this Thursday, 2 days ago, to the UN Security Council. The major UN agencies who deal with refugees, food, medicine, and by that I mean UNICEF, the World Health Organization, the World Food Program, they all testified that we're in a state of emergency. To continue on the food part, David Beasley of the World Food Program gave an update that said, last April, I told you we would have famine on biblical proportions if we don't act and have enough resources for emergency relief. He said it again last summer, and then yet Thursday, he said it is now happening, and the 5 major parts in the world are on the front line of this, and they happen to be Haiti and South Sudan, Northeast Nigeria, the part of the Congo, and Yemen. He concentrated on that, and he provided pictures to the media, which we will show here, a couple of them. He provided this picture and said, this is daily life in Yemen, but in fact, since a few days ago, the U.S. Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo, announced that the U.S. was designating the Houthis, people of Yemen, as terrorists. Even this situation is going to go to hell, because that means of the 30-some million people, 16 million are dependent on the World Food Program giving them aid, which won't be able to go through, and another 15 million or so depend on commercial purveyors, which won't be able to provide food. So you will create famine. The word Beasley used was, this is a death sentence. And he said, we don't have the resources as well to supply it, but this action of the State Department makes it impossible. He said, I'll take my UN hat off and put on my US hat. This decision of the US should be reversed. He said it should be reversed. Now, that gives you some idea. I won't repeat the figures here. We've done it before, and you can see in many places that this past year, we've been warned that already by September, 7 million people had died in the world of starvation. That's up a couple million more, I unfortunately think. And some 30 million are at that brink, including the 9-10 million in Yemen. And we have over 250, 270 million who are getting nearer to this condition. So look at what we're talking about here. If you switch to the pandemic, we've had for sure a known death toll of over 2 million internationally, and in the United States over 400,000. So that you see, we have a complete crisis, the dimensions I've stressed, and in fact, it's even more alarming when you consider the epidemiology of it all, that we have new variants of this SARS-CoV-2 virus, and you could even get a new kind of coronavirus. After all, the one we're fighting right now comes after MERS a few years ago, the Middle East respiratory syndrome, and it comes after SARS some years ago. The World Health Organization right now has a team in China to look at the origin area in Wuhan. So all of that is to say, even more, what are we going to do? It was a year ago when first internationally we knew of what would be, that we would have an epidemic, it became a pandemic on our hands. Well, we have to think the human impulse is to act. And the front end of this, as Paul just said, is healthcare. The medicine, the logistics, and also food. Food is medicine. So in the short term, we start acting and then do what we can on emergency power, water, and housing. So think about our action in three ways. First, as I said, the emergency action, which means makeshift arrangements, hospitals. We should be requisitioning cruise ships. There's a few hundreds of individual rooms and beds, using the military. For mass food relief, as the World Food Program is requesting, we could make the best use of existing stocks that are in different places in the world, and at the same time make sure and get in there the inputs, whether it's Africa or whether it's Nebraska or in the Pampas in South America. Get the input so you make sure you have enough production in the next crop cycle. So secondly, the longer term. At the same time, we should do the impossible and initiate the larger infrastructure programs that we've been not building, except with the exception of China and a few other places, which means stop the shutting down of electricity generation on a high-tech level in Europe and start resuming nuclear there and elsewhere, and do the same thing, the equivalent, when it comes to water, sanitation, and transportation. And thirdly, we have to have the kind of crash program sense about science and technology all the way along the line, whether it's use of drones for agriculture, or whether it's relief, or whether it's big infrastructure. So again, I don't need to repeat, but the program, the world needs 1.5 billion jobs internationally. That's what all of this comes to. And in the United States, that comes to 50 million at least new productive jobs. And I'll only say additionally that this program is circulating too in German, in Spanish. In last summer, it was a version of it was out as a roadmap in France. And so we have this kind of, we have the means, the ammunition here on how we have to think. I'll show one graphic from this program. I think it will come up because it gives us, well, before that, I forgot to leave this on because many people say there's nothing you can do. I'll take the green argument for a minute. Here you see some maps, and it goes back to what I said about new epidemics, new diseases, plant, animal, and humans can be expected in the future. This has to do with if you look at the world in terms of the density of population of humans in the upper left, poultry, ducks and geese and chickens in the upper right, pigs in the lower left. You see China, that's a great love for pork in China and a lot of pigs, and ruminants, cows and so forth in the southeast corner of the map you see. Now, that is the reality of, you take the earth and look at from the top, and that if you have a lot of humans, wild or not wild animals in close proximity, you can get avian flu, you can get swine flu, you can get diseases from bats. You can get Ebola from, I think, primates in Africa. The green outlook is, see, the earth is at the end. We have too many people, too many animals, and we have to cut them back, as I said about food to begin with. But in fact, the opposite is true. The crash program that we've had with warp speed and Russia had with its vaccine and China means that we have the bioscience and biomedicine that we can deal with millions, billions more people and bigger food supply. So now I think to the graph, it's just a single image here from the new report. And what I want to say about it, this isn't the time to scrutinize in detail, but this shows the United States, and it refers to the bar is the entire labor force and how they're deployed, what they're up to in year 2020 on the left, And the far right is 25 years from now, 2045, and the middle is a year from now, 2022. And the point is, the very bottom of the graph shows the share of work that people are doing that is in the productive sector: factories, manufacturing, construction, mining. You can include agriculture in that. And today in the United States, we have a small share, 15%, of what people are doing that's involved in producing the inputs for hospitals, the inputs for mechanized agriculture, the inputs for a new rail system. And we should up that to be about half of everyone's employment 25 years from now. So a year or two from now, we should be on the way up, as it shows. And then from the top down, that graph, and you don't have to see it again, but you're reducing unemployment, you're getting people employed. So the red disappears, that's unemployment. And the middle section becomes improved. Instead of so many people in the blue area that are doing things like all the staff for the mega banks in London and Wall Street, you have people doing other necessary things. Yellow represents healthcare. You expand that. And in the whole, the same kind of conceptualization can go for the world as a whole, for any individual country, and especially, for example, for the continent of Africa. So that just gives us an idea. And now, just to look at the impetus about this, Dennis Speed reiterated, we're looking from the mountaintop today as our aspiration. Instead of being down in the bottomlands where we're played off against each other, as Harley said, left versus right, U.S. farmers versus European farmers, city people versus rural people. You could think of all kinds of playing off against each other. It was last June that for the Schiller Institute, Helga Zepp-LaRouche, the president of it, announced we should actually have an initiative to deliberately act in the coincidence of opposites way, that is the coinciding benefit of opposites. And she took that from the famous 1400s thinker Nicholas of Cusa, as he's called. We could think in the American experience of the Abraham Lincoln period, when Lincoln's friend, Henry Carey, the economist philosopher, used the expression harmony of interests. There, from the top of an economy and a society, and between nations, there is a harmony of interest in this American system point of view. So anyway, proceeding from that point of view, that the human impulse is to take action. Here's a couple more of the photographs this week from Yemen that were released at the United Nations at the Security Council. And Beasley said, look, the man on the right there has the World Food Program logo on his back. Provide the food. These are 20-pound bags of rice, I think, just as an example. The next example shows healthcare. The World Food Program does the airlift for all of the medicines, vaccines, and other things you need around the world. And here's an example from Yemen. Provide the healthcare, that's the human impulse, provide the food. And I wanted to put another example from the cattlemen in Montana, because this kind of human impulse is going on domestically here. People wherever you live in this today see it. In Montana, cattlemen last June got together and they contribute cows and pay the money to have them ground up to delivered to food banks. So they've given out 18,000 pounds of ground meat. They call themselves the Producer Partnership, farmers and ranchers working to end hunger in Montana. But it's the same, on a different scale, it's what we have to be doing. And I think the one other side in passing that we should remember is we have a tremendous opportunity and responsibility to bring together opposites, and that includes the fact that in some parts of the world, people are fighting just for the privilege of being able to be productive. we are now in the 7th week in India of dozens of thousands of farmers staging a mass strike in New Delhi. And this is from a few weeks ago, to demand that new laws that were put in place to serve the interests of these bankers for de facto fascism want. These farmers are saying, no, we don't want these liberal laws that will allow so-called free trade that will ruin us and ruin the food supply. The India and China account for a quarter or more of all the world food production. The biggest producers of wheat, the biggest producers of rice. So you see here, this is what's at stake. So finally, I think that what we have here, I use the catchphrase, acting on human impulse. And Harley began by describing how our impulses are manipulated to act not in human ways, but to act in crazed ways, to act in violent ways, to act just the opposite. And I just end with the concept of the human response, which has been discussed in all the great cultures at their peak periods of power and beauty and creativity and throughout history. And this has been addressed. Usually you find it in texts or parables or children's stories to enculturate them. And think of all the depictions by painters. We had music to begin today, and we end with art of this organized presentation. Rembrandt painted many images of the Good Samaritan. And here you see the man, he's up at the gate, up at the door with the innkeeper, paying to have a stranger he found on the roadside who was robbed and stripped of his clothes. And the man from Samaria, the Good Samaritan, picked him up, put him on his horse, and he's checking him at this inn so he'd be taken care of. And that's one example of the impulse for a human impulse. And in the background, you see the woman at the well that's painted by thousands of painters because she was from Samaria and had no right to associate with anyone who was Jewish. And there was a thirsty Jew. She pulled up water and gave him money. I think it happened to be Jesus. I'm not a theologian. But the point is, this is the meaning of opposites. And I think that if we combine human impulse with reason, we can solve this horrendous crisis we're in now, today.
Thank you very much, Marcia. Diane Sayre, who was in Washington, D.C. on January 6th, is running as a candidate for the United States Senate in the state of New York against Chuck Schumer, who is now the U.S. Senate Majority Leader. It's become a nationally significant campaign, particularly since the double impeachment process from 2017 to 2021, which assaulted the American presidency. And she has a lot of things to say. We're going to let her just go right ahead and tell us whatever she wishes. Go ahead, Diane.
Thanks. Well, what I was thinking about is the question of warfare. In a sense, there's a kind of a war going on right now against this fascism, but it's not a military war. It's a different kind of a war. And I think when you are in war, one thing you have to know is, what are you fighting for? Marcia is beginning to get at that, to address it. The question, how do you actually defeat this kind of evil? And maybe I'll begin with some material from Why We Can't Wait and tell you a few things about what I'm thinking about this, because it's really very important. King talks about he starts the book with an introduction which gives you really a sense of the helplessness or futility that must have been felt by the Black population in the United States. He describes two children, a boy sitting on a stoop in Harlem whose house is infested with vermin. He says the drunks, the jobless, and the junkies are shadow figures of his everyday world. His father is one of the jobless, and his mother is a sleep-in domestic on Long Island. and a girl who's sitting on the stoop in Birmingham who is taking care of 6 younger brothers and sisters because her mother died in a car accident, and the neighbors say that she would not have died had she not had to wait to go to the all-Negro hospital, which is the only place that she would have been treated. And he says that people had to consider whether they could win by force, or how would they win this fight to achieve their innate rights of being part of the human race and treated as such in a society which had not been committed to that end. And he says here, it is an axiom of social change that no revolution can take place without a methodology suited to the circumstances of the period. During the 1950s, many voices offered substitutes for the tactic of legal recourse. Some called for a colossal bloodbath to cleanse the nation's ills. To support their advocacy of violence and its incitement, they pointed to an historical tradition reaching back from the American Civil War to Spartacus in Rome. But the Negro in the South in 1955, assessing the power of the forces arrayed against him, could not perceive the slightest prospect of victory in this approach. He was unarmed, unorganized, untrained, disunited, and most important, psychologically and morally unprepared for the deliberate spilling of blood. Although his desperation had prepared him with the courage to die for freedom if necessary, he was not willing to commit himself to racial suicide with no prospect of victory. And then he talks about the nonviolent doctrine that asked, he said it was not a doctrine that asked an eye for an eye, but one that summoned men to seek to open the eyes of blind prejudice. The Negro turned his back on force, not only because he knew he could not win his freedom through physical force, but also because he believed that through physical force he could lose his soul. Now, I just want to take this because from some of the questions in our meeting last night and some of the, while it's true that the vast majority of people protesting the theft of the election went to DC with the intention of conducting themselves honorably and nonviolently, as one person I know said who was there, and I was there, he said, I was astounded at how people who had come for a nonviolent protest and were conducting themselves in that way when confronted with the melee at the Capitol and people egging them on to storm the Capitol, suddenly changed their behavior and identity and became a mob. So the question is, and of course that was orchestrated, that was by design, as Harley already said. This thing began before President Trump even finished his speech. So the idea that he incited it was, of course, physically impossible. But to get this psychological effect, and part of it is you have to think about what you're fighting for. Is it merely that President Trump serves his second term, which he actually did win, but why did you support him in the first place? One very important reason, maybe the best reason why many Americans supported President Trump, is his pledge to end the regime change wars. We have, last I checked, was about a year ago, 277 million Americans who have been deployed to Iraq or Afghanistan since 2001. If you take their families and extended families, this is a very large portion of the younger generations of the United States who have been in a war with no purpose. And it's a very good example, frankly, of what I want to get at. But other reasons, people say, oh, build the wall. We don't want the illegals to have health care. Well, what is an illegal? Is that not a human being? And it caused me to think about our approach to defeating Obama's Nazi healthcare plan, because many people in the Republican Party had been opposing it because they said it's unconstitutional to force people to buy insurance. Well, that's true, but what's the point of our Constitution? It's in the preamble. What about the question of the general welfare? Because really, think about your life. Is your desire simply to get rich while you're here? How long are you going to be here? Maybe 100 years now, unless the standard of living really collapses. We got to win, so that's the average life expectancy, but we'll be generous. Maybe 100 years. How long has the planet been here? 5 billion years, 4 billion years? It's not a very big percentage of that. So what makes your life precious, or any of our lives? What made the life of Beethoven precious? Well, Beethoven still lives on through his music as long as people can perform it. And in fact, that's one of the worst things I ever think about in a nuclear war, if we were to lose what Beethoven had left us. So the meaning of your life, perhaps, if you're confronted, and LaRouche used to always say you should think about where the world will be 50 years after you've died, is the question of the immortality of mankind. So therefore, wouldn't you want to fight for something durable? Now, the approach that Lyndon LaRouche took when we heard about Obamacare was to look at what it was. And we found Joe Biden's buddy, Ezekiel, as we called him, Ezekiel Emanuel was one of the authors of this thing. And he said that your life is really only worth anything between about the ages of 15 to 45. So if you're under 15 or you're over 45, we're going to come up with some kind of a calculus. They called it the quality adjusted life years. So whatever, it doesn't matter if you're Beethoven or Einstein, or you're working on building a modern new high-speed rail system that's going to benefit future generations, or you're part of the Artemis program. Doesn't matter what you're doing, your identity. We're going to have an actuarial chart for how much it's worth spending on you and whether we should keep you alive or not, which brought to mind the famous posters from Nazi Germany where you see a hale, healthy man carrying a crippled man on his back, and the Hitler Nazi proposal, Tiergarten fear, of life not worthy of life, or the so-called useless eaters. And it was that point that LaRouche put the Hitler mustache on Barack Obama, because what he was proposing was a policy of genocide, a policy to turn human beings into animals and to turn human beings against each other. So if you think about where mankind should actually be 50 years from now, for example, how many people should we have on the planet? Should we have 25 billion people on the planet, perhaps? Mr. LaRouche once said the planet could easily hold 100 billion people. Should we have developed a colony on Mars by that point? And I think one of the reasons it's very urgent to think this way is because when you think about where the human race actually should be, then you can look at the policies coming out of the mouths of our disgusting Congress or the president-elect Biden, and you can see how profoundly evil they are, like what Marcia said about Pompeo declaring the Houthis in Yemen to be a terrorist group, which means, given how the United States wants to impose sanctions unilaterally, and we threaten any nation that violates these sanctions, all of the relief agencies and all of the countries that had been inclined to feed these 18 million people in Yemen facing death by starvation are simply not going to supply the food because they're afraid of provoking a reaction from the United States. So Mike Pompeo would have the death of up to 18 million people in Yemen on his hands. Is that not Nazi? And where is the outcry against this? Now, if you fight for something big, then what happens is you find in yourself the courage, instead of being afraid of the wrong thing, like, what's going to happen to my 401k? If you're afraid about the right things, then you say, well, what is my life worth? What would I give my life for? And in that, you find yourself liberated from a lot of the concerns that you see around you that we all tend to worry about, and are able to think about mankind as a whole. And I'll be very clear, this is not to say that nations don't have sovereignty or something like that. There is a very specific good that comes of different language cultures, the different contributions that different civilizations have made to the goodness of mankind as a whole. As President Trump said at the UN, which had the British screaming bloody murder, he said, every nation should be great. Every nation has the right to be great, and the leaders of those nations should look to that. But I would also say, if you think about Kennedy's statement, and people don't often quote the whole thing, where he said, ask not what your nation can do for you, but what you can do for your country, what you can do for your country or your nation, and ask what your nation can do for mankind. And I think if we in the United States began thinking from the standpoint of what we can give to mankind as a whole, we would lift ourselves to an entirely different standard of fight. And I do believe emphatically that given what just happened, over 75 million people voting for Trump, this crackdown with the social media, which is now being not just protested, but you have President Obrador of Mexico even speaking with foreign leaders about this. I think we are very much in a position to defeat this fascist British imperial system. But to make sure we defeat it, we have to have in mind the idea of mankind as a whole and what it is that we actually, where we want to be 50 years from now.
Okay, thank you, Diane. We put a lot of material out, obviously, and there's a lot I think that maybe the members of the panel want you to go through. We have a few questions, but I think what's going to be more important is to first just get any responses that anyone has. I'm going to start with you, Harley, and see if you have any responses to what you've heard.
I think the most important thing is this idea that you initiated at the beginning, looking from the mountaintop. We have too many people who get trapped in their profiles, in their prejudices, in their narrow views. And that's not to say they're not good people, but that what takes over their day-to-day concerns is, and they can be manipulated around this, is my family, my neighborhood, my people. And I think the great movements in history, including the American Revolution, operated from a different standpoint, the standpoint that's been presented in the discussion today, that we have to take care of what we can do to make ourselves instruments of the good. And that's not limited geographically or genetically, but it represents the you might say, the universal quality of a human being. So I think that's what we've been presenting And what people who have been trapped in these things have to do is take a good hard look at what's been done in the last 4 years that's been to manipulate you into either accepting the idea that you can't have a successful return to greatness in the United States based on the American system, that that's not going to happen, or the only way to get it is through violence. And those are the polar opposites that are being presented that are leaving people without much hope. And I think what we've presented today should give people some hope that we have it within us and that we are a movement that's committed to be taking everyone up to the mountaintop to be able to see what we see.
Paul, any thoughts at this point? Muted again.
Yep, got it. I would just hope that we can discuss just briefly what the people that we are working with, Marcia, I know in particular, as well as Dennis, working with people nonstop on this issue of a world health system and how it could be brought about, that Helga LaRouche first proposed way back at the end of January of 2020, when the pandemic at that time, it was only an epidemic and it was in China, but already it was possible to see what could be coming. A lot of work and outreach has gone into that, and I would hope we could discuss some of that in the course of the rest of the program. So that sort of an invitation to either of you to take that up, but that's all I would say.
Okay, I'm going to let Marcia take that up. I'll just indicate we've got 3 questions, but I think we can answer or begin to respond at least to what you said first. So, Marcia, if you have anything, both in terms of what Paul said or anything else that you wanted to bring up.
No, I'll just speak to what Paul said, because a number of American physicians, farm leaders, and many other people, community leaders, clerics, clergymen and women, and some international collaborators, especially Paris and in Germany, and collaborators in Africa, are working. I don't want to jump the gun because they are going to make their own announcements. You're talking about the Committee for the Coincidence of Opposites, but a number of them, or this grouping, has been working on concrete projects of the twofold nature, I'll tell you. One is an exemplary mission project where food, medicine, and also some potential youth training attached in the near future. A shipment will go from the United States to a location in Africa and maybe the Americas that represents the combined interest, as I said, of farmers, of medical experts and others, to make the point that we need the productivity of the and capacity of the medical sector, the agriculture sector, and everyday people to work together to relieve the situation in Africa and also to act in the United States. So a second exemplary project will be in an eastern city, most likely, a community health worker briefing and training program be initiated for youth by some veteran people in this area who've had past experience in medical training, military logistics, and humanitarian relief. So the only reason I'm not saying which city, which place, and so forth is a courtesy to the people involved who will do their own rollout in the coming weeks.
And what I'll do is just make people aware that on Monday, this coming Monday, January 18th, we will have, the Schiller Institute will be hosting a forum called A More Perfect Union Through the Coincidence of Opposites, Martin Luther King and the American Presidency. It will be addressed by Helga LaRouche, the founder of the Institute. And many matters will be taken up there, among them Truth and Reconciliation for a Citizens Committee on Truth in Elections. But on what was just said, let me just give an example. David Beasley, who we heard was referred to from the World Food Program, as a Republican. He was formerly the governor of South Carolina and distinguished himself there by being one of the first people to wish to take down the Confederate flag. He was initially opposed to that. There was a discussion with him. This is back in the 90s. And he proposed this, and he actually lost his election as a result the next time they came around. Eventually, the Confederate flag was taken down. But if you know something about South Carolina, which was the cultural center of the Confederacy, yes, the official center was in Alabama and so forth with Jefferson Davis, and also there was Richmond. But the cultural center was South Carolina. And so that's where the Scottish Rite of Freemasons, for example, temple down there, which is right close to the slave market, old slave market. You still have the hundreds of plantations that are down there. Now, of course, they've been converted, but nonetheless, if you go to Charleston, South Carolina, you feel that history. So Beasley, having taken that action earlier, is an important person to think about, because he has stated that he opposes the policy of the administration concerning Yemen, Mike Pompeo's announcement of a few days ago. Now, that qualifies him, especially given his concern about the impending disaster involving hundreds of millions of people globally on the food front. He's perfectly aware of the COVID question as well. To be a participant in this committee for the coincidence of opposites, because the whole idea here is that people are going to have political differences and should. People are going to have all the kinds of differences and should. And if you remember at the beginning of the program when Mr. LaRouche was talking about all these different cultures, these different nations, how do you relate to them? And so the conception of the committee and what we're doing and what has been done already is that it's been the case that many of the people in there tend to have a medical background. Obviously, that's of great importance because of the circumstances of the pandemic. But the idea for the American people and for us and for what we're trying to do here, I think is expressed in the fact that the origin of the idea came in the aftermath of the murder of George Floyd. And the problem was that there was not only going to be anger justified, there's also going to be anger and rage unjustified. There are going to be people agitating around it, which may be the circumstance that defines this character, John Sullivan, who, rather than being seen as a simple Black Lives Matter protester or being seen as a Trump supporter, posing as a Black Lives Matter protester, maybe he's neither. Maybe he represents the driven rage of our time, which seeks an object. And maybe he's manipulated in that way, or maybe he's part of agencies that manipulate in that way. And Diane already referenced, the fact that there was a problem in Washington, D.C., in that the assembly itself was not called to order by a higher principle, particularly a higher cultural principle. If you contrast the assemblies of Marian Anderson at the Lincoln Memorial or Martin Luther King, or other assemblies, including, by the way, the Million Man March done by Minister Louis Farrakhan in 1995, 25 years ago, which based itself on the principle of atonement. And it was the Reverend James Bevel who, in conversations with Minister Louis Farrakhan, emphasized at the time, the only reason to take all those people to Washington is if they are going to go there to atone for the things they've done wrong, not only in terms of the cities, but in terms of their own conduct of life. Until they've done that, don't take them there. If they're going to go there in that spirit, if it's a day of atonement, then and only then are they psychologically equipped, as Dr. King put it in a different context, to make any demand on anything. So the notion that you should just have all these Americans all over the country think they can make these demands, they have these rights to do all these things. Personally, I don't accept that at all. What are your responsibilities? You are contributing, as Reverend James Bevel used to say, at least 51% to any problem of oppression that you think you have. And the problem that we see in the world right now is that everybody who keeps marching saying we're right is letting the world sort of slide into a pandemic condition in which everybody's going to find out that they're wrong because they'll all be dead. Instead of that, the idea is a new health platform and an economic policy, which would be a crash program, maybe the largest in history, between the food, the clean water you're going to need, the power requirements, the transportation requirements, and then the healthcare requirements, which are going to require breakthroughs that are going to have to be made in optical biophysics or other fields in order for us to be able to even adequately treat this. This requires the brain power and manpower of every country in the world. And this had been a consistent proposal that had been made. And so all of last year, it was unfortunately not adopted. And that's what we think is the most important thing. And I think in the work that we've been doing, yes, it has been the case. We've made significant progress with many people, but everyone is invited, especially in the aftermath of the events of January 6th, to join that project. So I think I'll leave it at that. There are some questions. Let me just bring them up here, because actually the questions that we've gotten kind of indicate exactly why we need to take this from the Mountaintop standpoint. So I want to go to the first one, which was from Virginia, I believe, and it was this. It was actually about what we were just talking about. More than 3 months ago, one of our LaRouche leaders in South Africa, Philip Sokolabane, issued a dramatic and clear call for an emergency program to get aid in fighting the pandemic, as well as food to starving people in Africa. He included using the U.S. military to provide the logistics to this. It's obvious that for whatever reason, the Trump administration rejected this call and has done nothing. What can we do to mobilize behind that program now? So who would like to take that question? Marcia, you want to take that?
Well, I can just comment. Others can reply too. This is the ongoing mobilization. In other words, if the military had responded, wouldn't we be in a different stage of a continuing mobilization? And so you see, when it comes to playing off sides against each other, none of the usual sides, not the Republicans, not the Democrats, not the independents, not you. The questioner mentioned Africa. You'll notice that when it comes back in the U.S., the demand for emergency logistics for caring for people from the pandemic is very great, but we have not had the mobilization like we saw last March, April, and May, when the U.S. Navy ships were on the Pacific and Atlantic, when we had makeshift hospitals. We have some of that, but you'll notice we don't have that either. So I'm saying there's no magic element to this. It doesn't mean it's impossible, but the questioner is maybe yearning for it to have happened, and so am I. But we are creating the grounds for making it happen.
Okay, I'm going to ask other people to hold. I'm going to ask the second question because it's sort of related, and then I'm going to ask for all of you to respond. This one said, this is from New York. We are faced with the forces that would not hesitate to assassinate presidents, let alone anyone on this panel or anyone watching this panel. There are people like Pompeo who are only dragging us further into thermonuclear war's direction each and every day. How does the power of nonviolence overcome the forces of evil? Can nonviolence prevent a war and expose the true fraud of elections? Can nonviolence uncover the shady dealings of the last 50 years done by British forces in our own government? And that's basically the question. So I like these because this is the whole issue of the Mountaintop, because you cannot, I think, resolve these questions on a lower level. Harley, why don't I start with you, see what you have to say about this?
Well, when you talk about Dr. King, you realize that he was a great admirer of the Indian independence movement of Gandhi. And that nonviolent movement brought down the British Empire's control over India. And this had a big impact on Lyndon LaRouche, who was in India during the period immediately after the war and saw the mobilization underway. This gets to a bigger question, which is that people have to understand what is the force that's behind things such as the Great Reset, such as the economic policies of the International Monetary Fund that have not allowed Africa to develop. And at the same time, what is the force that's preventing the efforts, for example, of the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative to come into Africa and build up infrastructure? And similarly, the same force that was targeting Donald Trump for his desire to work with Putin, work with Xi Jinping to address the economic and military problems that were bequeathed to him by the Bush and Obama presidencies. So I think the starting point for this is that you have to know who the enemy is and be able to target that effectively. And what we've seen, just as an example, in the fight to overturn the election theft, was that after a positive start coming from Sidney Powell identifying a pivotal figure, Lord Malloch Brown from Smartmatic, the shift was made to target China, as though the Chinese Communist Party was able to shut down the vote count in 6 battleground states and allow for the massive switching of votes, which had to involve US intelligence agencies. So unless you know what you're fighting, and as Marcia, I think, said, know what you're fighting for, no movement will work. But I think that by organizing people to understand what is the history of this fight, and it's the American system versus the British system, that if people grasp that, then we can do things such as Paul mentioned, Glass-Steagall, which could take down the power of the banking system, the offshore shadow banking system, which controls the military-industrial complex. And that can be done in a nonviolent way. So there are tactics that you can come up with, but you need to know the battlefield.
Diane?
King addresses this, but before I say what he said, it's very similar to Friedrich Schiller's paper on the sublime, where he starts with, I guess, Lessing, no man must, that man is the creature who wills. And he says, but how can this, he said, therefore, nothing is so inhuman as to suffer violence or to inflict violence on another human being. But he says, if human beings have been given free will, how then do you reconcile the idea of death? Because isn't it the case that no human being can escape death? So how can you therefore say that we have free will? And then he talks, because what happens is people choose, as LaRouche said at the beginning, Christ's decision at Gethsemane, that your death becomes your own act. And by making an act of free will, and this is not to say just choosing suicide or something, but doing something that you know might result in your death, but creates a condition for immortality for mankind, you overcome this. That's what Martin Luther King clearly was thinking about after all of the threats against him, and when he went to Memphis to lead the sanitation workers' strike. So he describes it this way, and why we can't wait. When for decades you have been able to make a man compromise his manhood by threatening him with a cruel and unjust punishment, and when he suddenly turns upon you and says, punish me, I do not deserve it, but because I do not deserve it, I will accept it, so that the world will know that I am right and you are wrong. You hardly know what to do. You feel this is the powers that be. You feel defeated and secretly ashamed. You know that this man is as good a man as you are, that from some mysterious source, he has found the courage and the conviction to meet physical force with soul force.
Say in response to this myself just for a minute that on Monday, during the session that we're going to be doing on Monday, the Schiller Institute will be going on Monday. We're going to show portions of video from about 25 years ago with the Reverend Wade Watts of Oklahoma. And if you go on YouTube or other locations, you'll hear a story told by a man by the name of Johnny Lee Clary, who was the imperial wizard of the Ku Klux Klan of Oklahoma. And in 1979, the Reverend Wade Watts, who was the head of the NAACP and was also a major supporter of the Schiller Institute, debated Johnny Lee Clary of the Klan. And over the course of several years, he converted him. He became, that is, the Klan's leader, left the Klan, denounced the Klan, and became a preacher. It's important to watch that or participate in that on Monday, because that will demonstrate what we're talking about. When you talk about nonviolence, people always say when you talk about it, oh, sure, anybody can say that. But when you see how it works and how it was used, then the reason that that can be done in America is that the cases where it had to be done before were way more dangerous than the case that you're in now. And so the notion that Americans can treat other Americans with some notion that each of them or all of them are human, are made in the image and likeness of God, is something that's supposed to be what's being celebrated all this weekend and is supposed to be why the statue of King is on the mall. But since people like to reduce this to a racial matter, the king is a black hero, and that's why he has a statue, because he's black, or other such things. The actual breakthrough that was made, which was not merely Mahatma Gandhi, but it was Mahatma Gandhi with American characteristics. It was Mahatma Gandhi carried out in the context of the American Constitution. It supersedes as a method what Lincoln had to resort to. We no longer have to resort to that in the United States as a result of the fact that that was all dealt with before. And the notion that you have to resort to that means that you have failed to understand what your country has done. Matter of fact, it's downright unpatriotic. So I'm not against people having weapons. I'm all for the Second Amendment. I believe in that. What I'm saying is that when you are dealing one American to another, and that should be the way you're dealing with the rest of the world, there's no reason for that. At all. And I would just say that. Paul, we're going to go to you, but we actually have a question for you. And so if you have comments on what we just said, feel free to give them, but I want to read you the question. And this one was also from New York. This said, you were saying that fascism is first an economic policy and then a political policy. Franklin Delano Roosevelt in the 1930s stopped fascism through his economic and other measures. I think he means fascism in America. Stop fascism. But if this conference at Davos is the place where this process is going to be consolidated, what should we and other people do? What should we as Americans do, and what should other people do?
Well, okay, so that's two pretty big questions in a row. To go back to the previous question and then get to this one, I'm really the question about what can be the benefits of nonviolent, creative nonviolent social movement resistance in this kind of situation. I was very struck by something, Dennis, you just quoted from Reverend James Bevel, you are at least 51% responsible for the oppression that you think you are suffering, which I think he thought was universally true, no matter who he was talking to. And that identifies right away that this kind of creative nonviolence is not a tactic. It's not something that you simply figure, well, they'll never expect this, so let's try this. That kind of nonviolence is a lifting up of the thinking and the emotions of the people who are going to engage in it, so that they are in a situation, they're in a state where they can actually have the benefit of the other persons first in their mind, essentially where they can become good Samaritans. And this is really the first person who spoke about creative nonviolence as an effective social movement was the very famous English poet Percy Shelley, who went and applied it to the situation in Ireland in 1808. Terrible situation for the Irish. They had finally won a constitution in 1782, a real constitution. 20 years later, they had it taken away from them by the British Act of Union, back under complete British thumb. And there was a lot of agitation. There was a lot of agitation of various kinds, religious and otherwise. And Shelley, who was all of 18 years old, went there with pamphlets and passed them out himself and spoke at meetings and mass meetings. And he said and wrote, you have to improve yourself. You have to read. You have to study. You have to understand that what you want is the benefit of all of mankind, not just the benefit of you or your family. That didn't prevail in an instant, but it's interesting that Martin Luther King did look back to Mohandas Gandhi, and Gandhi in turn looked back to the Sinn Féin movement in Ireland before the First World War, where this creative nonviolence in both building up resistance, it always seems to be to the British Empire, it works, right? Including the British fascist imperial empire in London now, the financial fascism from London. Sinn Féin used it, and that's the reason that the Republic of Ireland exists today. Gandhi noticed that. He had been there. He had spoken to one or two of the leaders of the Sinn Féin. Of course, decades later became something very different, much worse than what it was then. But that was at the end of the 20th century. This was at the beginning. And these things, I think, always have that same principle that Shelley, for example, wrote about in both very powerful poetry and also prose pamphlets and leaflets and so forth in the decade of his short adult life, always on that idea that by making yourself better with respect to the general welfare of, wishing the general welfare of your fellow human beings, by making yourself a better Good Samaritan, you become capable of creative nonviolence. And that's, in fact, what the so-called strategy is. It's not a tactic. And it works against the British Empire. In fact, Gandhi, during World War II, the question was really put to him as a toughie. What do you say about Hitler? Are you nonviolent in the face of the unbelievable aggression, wars of aggression, and crimes of the Nazis? And he stood his ground on it, but at the same time, he organized such, by 1943, he had a great deal of influence even on what the British imperial forces there could do. He organized such that he made an invitation to the Allies to use India, although the Indians were going to, if he had anything to do with it, they were not going to be engaged in this, but that they could use India for the relief and defense of China and the supply of the forces which were fighting the fascists, the Japanese in that case, in China. And the interesting thing is that that offer was opposed by the British colonial administration of India, and I presume also by the colonial office back in London. But it was definitely welcomed by the American forces. So it can be put to the test, but it is not a tactic. Now, on the other question, I think the answer is very direct. It's implied in what the questioner said. We have to, right now, readopt the approach to the economy of Franklin Delano Roosevelt. He was unique in the world among major nations in being able to squash the incipient development of fascism. As some people know, the American Liberty League attempted to assassinate him, had an elaborate plan to do that. But earlier, the American Liberty League tried to persuade Roosevelt, as he was coming in for the first time, to become a dictator. So he squashed that, and he was unique. That didn't happen in France, didn't happen in any continental European country. It certainly didn't happen in England, where throughout the 30s, the royal family and half the government were strong supporters of Nazism. So Roosevelt was unique, and that was because he was both a good neighbor of other nations and an economic developer and a use of Hamiltonian credit to pursue development in an all-around sense, as shown by famously by the Tennessee Valley Authority, which still is waiting to be done. There are Tennessee valleys all over the world which are waiting to be fully developed in the way that the Tennessee Valley did that, and eliminate poverty and actually produce progress in those areas. So everything from his Bretton Woods idea at the end of the war to his good neighbor policy, we have to, that's what LaRouche's 4 laws really are in that track. And that's what we have to fight for.
Okay, well, thank you very much. We're pretty much going to draw to a close now. And as we do, I'd like us to entertain, this is sort of partially from a question that we're not going to ask. We don't want to take all the time now, but also may give people a way of thinking about, as you summarize the circumstance we find ourselves in right now as we leave this webcast. And so the question is, from the mountaintop, if you had the opportunity to speak to an assembly such as that one that happened in Washington, D.C., or an assembly of their opposites, their political opposition, some of whom might end up maybe getting through the 25,000 military to maybe be there, who knows? What would you say to them if you had the opportunity to address them? So that's kind of an interesting issue. But let's start with you, Marcia.
Well, I'd think more what I'm going to say, but I'll say because right away, speaking of the human impulse, we're going to roll up our sleeves and we are going to roll back the pandemic, the famine, the despair of no opportunity to be productive and be human. So I think I'd try and figure out a way to say that better. But that's what we have to do. And that bears, again, on the question. Let me put it this way. I second the motion that was implicitly made by you, Dennis, that the people, it's wide open for you actually literally to work with the Committee of Opposites. You can go on the Schiller Institute. There's a sign up document. You can find a welcome statement by Helga LaRouche about the principles involved, because really the good news is you have initiatives, the Good Samaritan sense, concretely in a lot of places, but nothing is coalesced. That's our job? One example, speaking of military, is just a month ago, 2 states, National Guards, one I think was Nebraska, came back from Czechia, the Czech Republic, where they had been asked to help out on building makeshift hospitals. And one of the military reserve person, or the National Guardsman coming back, said, "This is the best thing I ever did in my life. This is what we ought to be doing." There are 15 states, 18 states in the US have National Guard relationships on a sister government to government basis with whole nations of Africa. And so the issue is, from the highest level, to coalesce these into the shift to make all the difference in the world. That's our New Year's task, and I think that's where we are, and that's what needs to be addressed.
Thanks. Paul, how about you? I know you've been talking a lot, but figure go to you.
Yeah, let me not talk too much longer, because I think I was just trying to address what the questioner asked in the last thing that I said. A person must think about, if there's an assembly of persons, as I think, Dennis, you indicated quite a while ago, they must be there for a purpose, and that purpose must involve their taking responsibility for the general welfare of their fellow citizens, and really for the general welfare of our fellow nations. That's the state of mind in which they must organize themselves to do anything important. And there was a pretty dramatic change for the worse in the ability of Americans to think that way in the period after John Kennedy, Robert Kennedy, Martin Luther King, Malcolm X were all assassinated. And then this shock in 1971, when the speculative system took over as a world monetary system, and this country began to be deindustrialized. Before that time, we had a leader such as John F. Kennedy, for example, immediately before then, who held up before the American people as examples the public servant who was willing to sacrifice in order to better the condition of humanity, the Peace Corps volunteer, the inventor, the scientist. I had the privilege of attending one of the very last speeches that President Kennedy gave, perhaps the last one, at the end of October of 1963, when I was an undergraduate, and the subject of that speech was poetry and poets. That was an idea which Americans allowed themselves to embrace, coming from such a leader, of what the ideal of America is, or what the ideal of an American is. At the same time, astronauts were definitely in that pantheon. But now we find ourselves in a different situation, where most Americans, when they think of what is it that we have that we can be proud of, they all come to the same thing: our armed forces. Now, that may be true, but why does everyone, whenever they think now of something important that has to be done, say, let the armed forces do it? Whether it's vaccinating the population, or whether it's building some facility abroad, or transporting food let the armed forces do it, as if that was all that we now had. We have to organize an entirely different basis and do it with the approach to economics and the approach to development that last was seen in full with President Franklin Delano Roosevelt. And Lyndon LaRouche devoted himself to laying those kinds of policies out in the current terms, and making them, giving them pungency and force, as he used to say, and giving them power. We have to organize ourselves to carry those out, and that takes that kind of view of ourselves.
Okay, thank you. Harley?
Yeah, I think the important thing is that Americans, if they know what it's about, will not accept the Great Reset. Many nations around the world will not accept it. Nations such as Russia and China that have a sense of themselves as sovereign nations will not submit to a global banker's dictatorship. Now, what we do have that we can rely on and be proud of, if we know about it, is how the American system works and how it's been an example to the world of how institutions of self-government can develop the creative potential of a population. That's something to be optimistic about. The scientific and technological optimism that's characterized the best moments in American history is not over because a bunch of people like Bill Gates and George Soros and John Brennan say it is. The America that we believe in and that we fought for of the founding fathers is based on philosophical principles that are natural and everlasting. And I think that if people have a sense of that, they won't succumb to depression, demoralization, pessimism, that they'll realize that we have the potential to defeat this fascism just as we defeated global fascism in World War II. So I would say, take this example of the American system, learn about it, study it, look at LaRouche's 4 laws, how they reflect the best potential that exists in our people and people all over the world, and then fight for that.
Thank you, Harley. So, Diane, for you, this is not exactly a theoretical question. Whatever else you're going to answer to.
Well, I would say first, people should have faith in the goodness of your fellow human beings because we can win this. And I have to say, I started feeling optimistic just when Marcia said roll up our sleeves, because as FDR said, there's a dignity in work. And we should take the approach, it's true, there has to be more than the military, but how do you create it? I had not realized until that brigadier general who was on the part of this coincidence of opposites committee talked about the fact that FDR had worked with General Douglas MacArthur on figuring out the CCCs. Now, I believe, and someone I'm sure will correct me in an email or otherwise if I'm wrong, but I think one of the things that MacArthur had to do was in Korea, he was having a very hard time getting enough troops to do what had to be done. And they had a program where every American soldier had to adopt a Korean soldier and train them. And that way they could actually double their manpower, or it may have been a slightly different ratio, but you recruit and you organize and you get the people to develop the skills that are needed. There's nothing more optimistic and fun than that. And we have a vast number of people in the United States right now who are not only unemployed, if they were employed earlier or are employed now, they are misemployed. We have a massive amount of work that needs to be done, but no one is doing it. And that has to be shifted, and it could be shifted in such a way. So I would really say that we should have a lot of fun. We're going to need an uproarious sense of humor because we're dealing with some really evil bastards, and you don't want to let them scare you. You want to be able to make fun of them. And you should check yourself, make sure that you're fighting for the right thing.
All right. So thank everybody. Thank Diane Sayre, Paul Gallagher, Harley Schlanger, Marcia Mary Baker, and thank everybody who listened. We want to again invite you to join us on Monday at 1 p.m. for A More Perfect Union Through the Coincidence of Opposites, Martin Luther King and the American Presidency. So on behalf of the LaRouche organization and our Saturday Manhattan town meeting and Lyndon LaRouche himself, we want to thank you all for listening, and we'll see you hopefully on Monday.